Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to insert data via a form into a MS SQL database using Blazor. We will go and set everything up from scratch. So we're going to create a new Blazor server app, and we're also going to create a new database inside Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. And it is a tutorial that will be for people who are very new to Blazor, and also for people who want to know how you just make a form and insert the data in a database. So this is the form that we are going to create, and as you can see, I want to insert a new car to a database. So we have a brand which is a string. You can see I can choose Toyota here. We will select a year for when the model is created, so let's say 1997, and the model will be, in this case, Corolla. So as you can see, we have two strings now that we want to insert to the database. We have one integer, and then I also created this checkbox so that we can have a bool that we're going to insert to the database also. So if the car have a spare wheel, we're going to check this. Then we can click on add car. Right now, if I click, you can see nothing is happening, but it is actually happening. But we're also going to create a response, like a little box that will go and tell if the data has been saved successfully in the database. So first of all, let's go and create a new Blazor server app. So we will open Visual Studio 2022, and we will go and create a new project. We want to create a Blazor server app and say next. And we could call the project Save Data by Form App and say next. We will use the .NET 6 version, so we just want to go and say create. So the very first thing we will do is to go and create the connection to an MS SQL database, and for that we will be using Entity Framework. So the first thing we will do is to go and right click the project, say that we want to manage NuGet packages, then we want to go to browse, and then we want to find Entity Framework. So you could go to the search bar and write Entity Framework core, but I do already have the packages here, so it is this one. We're going to install the Microsoft Entity Framework core. And we don't want to install the 7th version, we want to go and install the newest 6th version, because it will then match our .NET 6 framework that we are running the application with. So we want to say install, say I accept, and because it's an MS SQL server that we want to connect to, we also want to go and install this Microsoft.Entity Framework core.SQL server. And again, we want to go and choose the newest 6 version. And if you're wondering why I use the 6 version and not 7, then it is because the .NET 6 is a long-term supported framework, and the .NET 7 is just a short-term supported framework. Soon there will be a .NET 8, and that will also be a long-term supported framework. So hopefully in the future I'm going to create videos with .NET 8 instead of .NET 6. But let's go and install this package and say I accept. And for now, the final package we want to install is this Microsoft.Entity Framework core.tools. And again, we want to choose the 6th version. This tool package will allow us to use commands like add migration. We are going to use that, and also to update the database. So let's go and install the newest 6th version and say I accept. So now when that is installed, let's just shortly go and open Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, just so that we can actually go and create a new database for our project. So let's go and connect to the SQL server, and let's open the databases. And as you can see, I actually created a cars database. So instead of making a new form with cars, let's try to go and create a new one with just some countries maybe. So we want to right click the database and say new database, and let's go and call this for countries. And the only thing we have to do is actually just to say OK. So it will create a database called countries, and now we can go and use that database. If we just expand it and look at the tables, then we can see inside our tables here that we don't have any tables. So now back in Visual Studio, we will go and create a new folder inside our project here, because we want to add a model folder. Or we could actually call it models if you have multiple models. And what this will contain is actually just the objects that we want to specify. So in this case, we want to have a model called country. So we want to go and say that we will add a new item, and we could just call it country. So we will say add. So we need to get this country some properties. And the properties we're giving it here will actually be the columns inside the table that we're going to create. So we will actually, in our countries database, we will make a table called country. And it's actually first now I can see that it might be a little bit confusing because the database name is going to be called the same as the table. But well, that is what we're going to do now, because if we go back here to the database, we can actually see that inside my cars database, when I expand it and see the tables, I do have a cars table also. And of course, it's also just to make an example, so it will be okay. So we will have an object called country. And the reason it is country and not countries is because this will be an object for only one country. And if you don't understand it, just stick with me. It will make better sense soon. So first of all, we want to go and say prop, and then you can hit tab twice, because then we want to make our first property here, and it will be an int, because the first property is going to be the ID. And because Entity Framework is pretty smart, it will actually automatically create this as the primary key, because I think it's because of the ID. So the name ID will automatically create this as a primary key. But let's continue. So the next thing is actually to make this a string, because I think that we need a name for the country. So we could just say name, and then the next property could actually be an integer, because I want to create this as the population. Then we want to go and create a new property again, and in this case it will be a string, and this is going to be the capital of the country. And then last, so that we can have like a checkbox so that we can save a boolean, we will go and say bool, and then we will say have mountains. So if the country have mountains, we're going to set it to true, or else we're going to set it to false. So now that we have our model for the table that we want to create, we can go and create our DB context file, which is the file for Entity Framework to actually configure the connection to the database. So typically you want to put it inside your data folder. So let's go and create a new item here. And I like to call it app db context, and then just say add. And this class, we actually have to extend it. So we want to use the db context. And as you can see here, we have the db context from the package that we just installed, the Entity Framework core package. So let's go and hit enter on that. So now you can see at the top, we're going to use Entity Framework core. So the next thing we want to add is actually this method. It is a method that is called onConfiguring, and it's actually coming from this DB context. So we can go and override it, and you want to go and return a void on this one. But when we override this onConfiguring, we are actually able to go and get this class called DB context options builder, where, just to make it a bit better to understand, we call it options, because then inside this method we can actually go and configure the options to our connection, so that Entity Framework core knows what it should connect to. And as you can see, without typing anything, it actually says that we could use options and then .use SQL server, and that's exactly what we're going to use. So just hit tab on this one, and let's just close it off here. So the only thing that this use SQL server wants is actually just a connection string. So how do we find the connection string to the SQL server? So the way we specify it is by saying that we want to have a string, and then first of all we want to specify a server. So we say server, set it equal to, and we can just close it so we don't forget to do that. And this one will actually just be the server name. So if you open your Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, and actually just to close it again, because if you open it again, then before we connect to the SQL server, we have the name of the server here. So we can just go and take this name, copy it, and put it inside this server. We then want to specify what database that it should listen to. So we will just go and say database, and again equal to, and just let's close it. And in this case, we called the database for countries. And a last thing that we need to do in the connection string that is less obvious than the database and server is to go and say is this a trusted connection? And we do have to set this to true, else it will not work. So normally you would not put your connection string directly into this use SQL server because it is seen as being unsecure. So I will just quickly show you how you put it inside your app settings.json file and then actually get it into the AppDB context so that we get it from the app settings instead of just typing it hard-coded in here. So to do this, we will add some space up here, and then we would actually go and dependency inject the I configuration into our AppDB context. So when we make a constructor like this, it is the same name as the class. Then if we go and put this I configuration here, it will be a dependency injection, because then we can go and take this configuration, and actually, as you can see now, when we take this configuration, we cannot just put it down here because it is inside this method, it's not inside this method. So when you dependency inject, you want to create a property out here. In this case, we can go and make a protected read-only I configuration and then call it configuration. So it's pretty much the same name here, but this configuration, we are able to actually go and put it inside this method. So when you create a new instance of this class, this will run for the first time, or at first, before anything else. That's why it is a constructor. It is to set up the class before we can actually go and use the other methods. So we will go and say that this configuration, that is actually like a global one inside this class, so we can use it everywhere. We're going to set that equal to the configuration that we have in here, and that is a dependency injection. So now what we can do down here is to actually, we want to go and save this string, but before we can actually go and put it inside our app settings.json, let's go to the app settings.json, and here at the top we just want to make some space. Then the first thing we will do is to add this connection strings, and it is actually very important that the name is connection strings. I will show you in just a moment why, but inside here we can go and put the actual connection strings. And this name, it really doesn't matter what you call this one, so we can just say that this is our DB connection string, and that should be set to the connection string that we just created earlier. So let's go and take this connection string, copy it, and insert it here. So now we have the connection string out in our app settings.json and not directly inside our AppDB context. So we can just go and get rid of this. And then we actually want to go and use the configuration that we just created, or that we just dependency injected, because then we can say dot. And now you can see here, it actually says get connection string. And the reason that we will call it connection strings like this is that if you go in here and see, if you say dot, then you can see down in the description here that the get connection string is actually shorthand for get section. Oops. Get section and then connection strings. So it's actually looking specifically for the connection strings name, and then it will just take a name with which we will specify. So now just go and hit enter on this one, and then we want to put in a parameter, and the parameter here is actually just the name that we put inside the connection strings. So in this case it's the DB connection string. Go and copy that and put it in here, and now everything should actually be good to go. So the last thing we will do is to tell Entity Framework that we also want to create a table. So the way we do that is by saying public and then say db set, and this db set will take a generic class, so it can be any object that we want to have it to create a table from. But in this case we already have our country object that we created earlier, so we can just go and hit enter on this one, so it will add the models folder up here, and then we had the name of the table, and I would just go and call it for countries. And finally we also need this get and set. So the last thing I will do, and I actually don't know if it's necessary, but it is a good thing to do, so inside our program.cs file we will add the AppDB context as a singleton. So like we have this weather forecast service, just go and copy and paste this, and then say add DB context, and that should actually be it. You can try to migrate and see if everything works without this. I actually don't know. I just usually put it as a singleton because then I don't hit any problems when programming with the app.db context. So let's go and see if this is working. So if we expand this window, we actually down here we have the package manager console. So the first thing we will do here is to add a migration. And what this will do is actually just create a file for us that will make the changes to the database. So let's go and say add migration init, because this is the first migration that we're going to add. So let's hit enter, and it said that build is succeeded. So if we look at the file that it created, we can now see that it will create a table. It will be called countries. It have an ID, a name, population, capital, and does it have mountains? So it will actually create everything for us. And here you can see it will also create the primary key. And this is of course all in the up method. So this is when we actually update the database now. We also have a down method, and that will actually just to be dropping the countries table. So if we go back to the package manager console, we can scroll down, and now we can actually just say update database and hit enter. So it said that it succeeded and it has applied the migration. So let's try to go back to SQL Server Management Studio and say connect, and let's try to open the databases. So in this case we created the countries, and let's open the tables, and now we can see we do have the countries table here. So if we right click and say design, we can see that we have all the properties that we created, but now they're just columns in this table. So when the database is set up, let's go and actually create what we came for, which was the form. So I will go and create the form at the front page. So that will be the index page. Inside our pages folder, we have the index.razor file, and this is our front page. So let's just go and delete these things. Let's make the page title to countries. And first of all, let's go and create a headline. So in this case, just an H3 tag, and it will just say add a new country. So the first thing I will do is to actually go and create the code section, because in here we can create a property, which will be a country object, and I will actually call it for new country, and we will get rid of this get and set because we will set it equal to a new country. And as you can see, it don't know where country come from, so let's just click on it and say alt enter, and now you can see that the models folder is being suggested here. So let's choose that one, and now it will add this using the models folder. So the reason I want to create this property first is because when we now have an object called a country, we actually know that this new country have all the attributes or all the properties that is in here in our model. So for example, if we just quickly create a method like this one, just a test method, we can actually go and take the new country and say dot, and then you can see it actually have all the properties inside that we can go and target. So we could go and say name and put that equal to maybe hello. Doesn't make sense, but it is just to say that we can actually go and put some data into the different properties that we have access to. So let's just go and get rid of this again. And Blazor actually have a very smart way to handle this object that we just created. So what we can use is actually to use a Blazor component instead of a HTML tag. So we don't want to use the form tag from HTML, but we do want to go and use this called edit form. So it's just like a form in HTML, but this is just Blazor's way to say that we have a edit form instead. And then the very smart thing here is that we can go and specify a model that we will use inside this edit form. And if we just use this @ sign, we can actually go and say that we want to say that this is a new country. This is the model that we want to use. The next thing we want to specify inside this edit model is actually this one, on valid submit, because in here we're going to specify what method we're going to execute when the form has submitted successfully. So we could just go and call it submit form, and that's actually it for this edit form. So we can just go and create this method. So when creating this method, we need to say that it is async and it's going to return a task. And we have to give it the same name as we do up here. So next up, inside our edit form, we want to go and use another Blazor component, which is called input text. So it's like an input field, just not HTML style, but with Blazor instead. And what do we want to do with this input field? We actually want to go and bind it to this country and then .name. So we could actually just go and create a label so that we can see that this input field or this input text is going to be the name that we want to specify. And then what we can do is that we can go and say bind the value. So whatever we're going to put inside this input field, it is going to bind to the value of this new country dot name. So it is a very nice and simple and clean way to actually bind a property inside an object to an input field, because no matter what they put inside the input field, it would just be saved inside this name property. So now let's go and add some line breaks just so that we get a little bit space between the input fields. And we could just go and copy and paste this, but in this case it will be a number, so we can go and say that this was the population, and then we also want to target the population instead, so we say population. And now you can actually see that we get a red underline, and that's because the population is actually an integer, so we cannot say input text, we have to say input number instead. And then again, let's go and add some line breaks. And in this case, we could just go and copy and paste this, because the next one is actually just a string and it was just the capital. So I just changed this one to capital and also this one. And because this is a string, we still have the input text. So the last one is actually our checkbox. Again, we want to go and just make some line breaks now. And we could go and copy and paste it once again. And then we could say, do the country have mountains? So what we will say is have mountains, and again it gives us a red underline because this is going to return a bool and it actually wants a string. So instead of text we want to say checkbox instead, and that is actually it. So this is our form here. We have some input fields, and what we want to do now is to actually go and create what is inside this submit form. So when we submit the form, we will go and save it inside the database. And earlier, because in the program.cs that I did this add singleton at the app.db context, it actually allows us to go and dependency inject the app.db context into our index file here. So the way you want to do that in Blazor is to say inject and then say data.app.db context, and then just call it for db context. So now we can actually go and use this db context variable, which is actually just an instance of our app.db context. So if I go and take this db context and then say dot, because when we say dot we can actually go and just type the table that we created. It was the countries table, and then we can go and say add. And what we want to add when the form is submitted is actually just the new country, because we have a whole object where all the values will be inside. But this will not actually create the changes to the database. It will just prepare them. So we can go and say await, and then take our db context and say save changes async. And when this is executed, it will actually go and put the data inside the database. So let's go and test this, and if there's any errors we will go and fix it. But if we just open our database here, we can see if we right click the countries table, we can go and say select top 1000 rows, and right now we don't have any rows. So let's try to see if we can insert one row now by using the form. So let's try to run the application, and this is actually how our form looks right now. We just missed one very important thing, and it's actually the submit button. So let's just go and add that one. So down at the bottom of our edit form here, we can actually just go and create a normal button. As long as we say that this button should have the type of submit, then everything should be okay, and we can just go and say submit. And just to keep all this simple, I have not styled it like the form that you saw in the beginning, but the style at the beginning, it was only just Bootstrap that I used. And you can actually go to the description of this video so you can get all the code. The code will not be all what you see here, what we created in this video, but it will be the code from the form that you saw in the beginning. But now let's go and save this and let's try to run the application again. So let's go and have a name of a country. I live in Denmark, so I say Denmark. And I actually don't know how many people, maybe 6 million people. And the capital is Copenhagen. And do you have mountains? No, we don't have any mountains. So let's try to submit this. And now you can see we don't actually get any response when we submit because we haven't set that up yet. But let's go to the database and let's see if we actually get anything in here. So again, we can right click the countries table and say select top 1000 rows. And we actually got the data inside our database. So I will go and show you how you make the response on this page so that we can actually see that something is submitted. And I guess that the best thing to do is to go to our edit form here, and actually first let's make some line breaks between the checkbox and the button. And again, let's go and put the line breaks under the button. This is not the most beautiful HTML or CSS or styling, but it will get the job done for now. So what I will do is to actually go and make an if statement. So if something is true, and this something will actually be a variable that we're going to create in just a moment, I will just call it sent. So if it is sent, or actually maybe saved is a better word, then we will go and display a paragraph that will say that the item is, or let's say the country is created. So now let's just go and make this saved property here, or this saved variable. So it will be a bool and it is called save, and it will be false when we first load the page. So what I think we could do is to go inside our submit form here, make a try catch, and then put these two inside the try. And we will also put this saved inside and say true. So let's say in this case that the try here is actually going to just run through all the codes without any exceptions. Then we might say that this is actually saved. Of course, maybe something else could go wrong, but you can actually just go on and on to make the system better. But this is just the solution for now. We could also just go and say that when we actually start this submit form, then we will always go and say that it should be false at the beginning, because it is actually just a new try every time we hit the submit form button. And then if everything went smooth, it will just go and be true and display this the country is created paragraph. You could also go and just copy this and paste it in and say error. So in this case we want to say something went wrong, and then do the exact same thing here. So we want to create an error here, a error variable, and at the beginning at the submit form we will also go and make this false, but we do want to go and make it true if we come inside this catch. So we say true in here. Another thing I want to do when we submit the form is actually when we have a new country that is being added to the countries table, then after this we actually want to create a new instance of the country table. So let's just go and copy this, and we could do it outside here. So when the form is submitted, it should just go and actually erase everything. Actually, we should maybe just put it in here, because if it is saved, then we actually want to remove all the information, so that if it is not saved and there was an error, we might not want to delete everything. So let's try to see if this works, and again, if it doesn't work, we're going to fix it. So the form works for now. We can just go in and say Denmark again, 6 million, and the capital is Copenhagen. But in this case I will call it Copenhagen 2 because we already have one. And let's say that there is mountain in Denmark now, and say submit. So it took a little while, actually just a couple of seconds, but the country is created, it says, and it actually cleared out this form. So you could go and expand this even further. So when you know that there is a little bit of time where you have to wait here, you might want to go and add a loading icon while we're waiting, but I will not go and cover that in this video. But what I will cover is actually how you make this thing required. So if you have an input field like a name of the country, it should be required to have a name. So I will show you how you do that with data annotations. So let's go and close this, and let's go and open our model over here. So the country model. So let's say that the name should be required. So above the name here, we're actually going to create a data annotation, and we want to say required. And now when we type required, we can see that it want to use this system.component model.data annotations, and that is the class that we want to use. So just hit enter, and then it will add the data annotations using at the top. So now we can see that the name is actually required now. We can go back to our index file, because then up in our edit form here, we should go and add this line called data annotations validator. So that just means that this form will actually go and look at the data annotations to see if there is any specific things that it has to look at. And in this case, there is a specific thing with the name now. But the last thing I will show you here is the way that we can actually go and display an error message. So this is the component you want to use for the error message. You can see validation message. Then we have to tell it what is this validation message for, and then you can go and use this lambda expression and say that it is for the new country.name. So now if it finds any validation problems with this name, and it will go and look at the data annotations which we just created in here. This is a data annotation, and we said that it should be required. So let's go and try to test this. So let's say that we just hit submit now, and now you can see we actually have the validator message component that will show this error, or what the actual error is. And in this case, the name field is required. So it is a handy way to create some validations on your form. You can also go and make it more specific. So let's say inside the name, it is required, but we have some more requirements for the name. So let's try to make a new data annotation here. And we have a data annotation called string length. So let's say that the length should be maximum 10 characters. And then we can actually go and specify our own error message. So as you can see, an error message, and then we can say the name is too long. So if they create a country name over 10 characters, then it will go and display this. Let's try to do it. So let's save it and run the application, and let's just try to type something here. So it's a long country name, and we say submit, and now you can see the name is too long. And if we just remove it, and now you can see it actually says that the name is required. I didn't even have to hit submit on this one. So it's actually not even submit you have to hit. If we just hover over here, you can see if I fill this one and I just get it out of focus, then it says that the name is too long. And if we just remove it again and remove the focus, you can see it will actually instantly go and say that there is something wrong. There is a lot of other different data annotations that you can go and use, but I think this is it for this video. I hope you learned something about the Blazor form and how easy you can actually go and submit things and save it inside a database. It is really object-oriented programming at its best. But thank you for watching, and go and have a nice day. Bye.